China's sudden restriction on U.S. auto parts is more than a trade measure. It signals a recalibration of global transport corridors, where trucks, the backbone of freight logistics, are now caught in the crossfire. What looks like a technical regulation is in fact a strategic maneuver, reshaping how nations move goods, secure supply lines, and control the very flow of economic power. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you quote re-seeing on the ground, so you stay a step ahead. The global context has shifted. Supply chains, once optimized for efficiency, are now being re-engineered under pressure from sanctions, export controls, and retaliatory tariffs. The notion of seamless cross-border flows is collapsing. Instead, fragmented routes emerge, defined by geopolitical alignments rather than cost or speed. Mobility becomes not only a logistical issue, but a question of sovereignty. For trucks, the implications are immediate. Freight relies on predictable corridors. But as China recalibrates its trade architecture, established paths between Asia, the Americas, and Europe are disrupted. Ports adapt, rail spines are remapped, and road freight must absorb rising costs. Every new checkpoint or restriction reverberates through entire industries, from agriculture to high-tech. Energy adds another layer of strain. Diesel pricing is increasingly volatile, dictated less by market fundamentals and more by strategic reserves, embargoes, and infrastructure sabotage. For long-haul trucking, fuel insecurity compounds the shock of restricted parts availability. Trucks may be grounded not by mechanical failure, but by deliberate chokehold on the resources that keep them running. At the same time, regional blocks consolidate. Nations are forced to decide whether mobility aligns with USA-centric trade routes, China's Belt and Road initiatives, or emergent corridors in Africa and Latin America. Truck fleets are no longer neutral carriers of goods. They are assets and liabilities shaped by which supply chain they belong to. The conclusion is stark. Mobility has ceased to be background noise in global trade. It is now a frontliner competition, and the decision to ban parts is not about spare bolts or sensors. It is about control over which economies can keep their trucks rolling when the corridors tighten. Automotive production for trucks is unraveling beneath the surface. Agreements between US and Chinese manufacturers once guaranteed stable flows of components. Today, those understandings are dissolving quietly. What used to be routine supply contracts are now subject to sudden suspension or politically motivated review. The silence is deliberate. No one wants to admit how fragile the arrangement has become. Tariffs deepen the divide. For every imposed restriction, hidden dependencies are exposed. Many U.S. trucks rely on Chinese-sourced electronics, sensors, or heavy-duty engine parts. Alternatives exist in theory, but ramping up production outside China is costly and time-consuming. Factories in Mexico, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia struggle to fill the gap, but they cannot replicate scale or price. Technology dependence is the hidden fracture. Truck systems, increasingly digitalized, rely on semiconductors and advanced batteries tied to Asian production. Without them, fleets risk obsolescence. Operators face the paradox of needing to modernize fleets for emission standards while lacking access to the very parts required. Every missing chip slows not only individual trucks, but entire economies. Secondary markets react. Used truck parts become scarce, while counterfeit components proliferate. The risks are higher. Unverified supply chains feeding fleets that must keep moving. Insurance premiums rise as breakdowns and failures become more probable. What once was a regulated flow of trade is devolving into a shadow economy of survival-driven procurement. This creates a strategic bottleneck. By restricting parts, China forces dependence on alternative networks that are slower, less efficient, and more expensive. The balance of power is not only about who builds trucks, but about who decides when they stop moving. And this leverage is being tested right now. Security is redefined in this environment. Trucks, outfitted with IoT systems, GPS, and telematics, become data nodes on wheels. Every movement transmits information, location, cargo, speed, even driver behavior. Control over these streams is as valuable as control over the vehicles themselves. When parts are restricted, so too is access to the technologies that feed these systems. Artificial intelligence enters as a force multiplier. Predictive maintenance for trucks relies on continuous data flow, but disruptions in supply chains of sensors or chips disable these safeguards. Fleets without smart monitoring revert to reactive maintenance, increasing downtime. The result, operational risk rises and exposure to accidents or failures grows. Cybersecurity becomes the second battlefield. Trucks increasingly integrate autonomous driving modules and AI-based routing. Each is a potential entry point for intrusion. If key components are denied or replaced with lower standard alternatives, vulnerabilities widen. State and non-state actors alike recognize trucks as both logistical lifelines and exploitable targets. Surveillance expands beyond vehicles to logistics infrastructure. Ports, warehouses, and highways form digital ecosystems where data is cross-referenced with truck telemetry. Restrictions on U.S. parts mean that Chinese-designed alternatives might dominate these systems. The data then flows not westward but eastward, shifting the intelligence advantage. What seems like a simple ban on hardware is therefore about information dominance. To control the truck is to control the cargo. To control the cargo is to control the economy. And the struggle over these components is a struggle over who commands visibility and global mobility. Perceptions differ sharply across regions. In the United States, the ban is framed as an economic attack. Industry leaders warn of disrupted fleets, stranded cargo, and rising costs. Policymakers call for accelerated domestic production, but timelines stretch years into the future. The public hears of delays in goods delivery without realizing the structural fragility beneath. In Europe, the response is more fragmented. Germany and France, dependent on both US and Chinese trade, seek middle ground. But Eastern European economies, reliant on truck freight through Eurasian corridors, quietly align closer with China. The divergence reflects not only economic calculus, but also political will. Asia sees a different narrative. For China, the move consolidates power. For neighboring economies like Vietnam and India, the opportunity to absorb displaced supply chains is real but constrained. Infrastructure gaps and lack of capital limit their capacity to fill the void. The perception is less about crisis and more about competition. Governments weigh consumer reactions carefully. Rising prices for the transported goods trigger public frustration. But governments attempt to shift blame toward external rivals rather than admit structural dependence. The narrative management becomes part of the strategy. Controlling perception buys time, even as actual fleets weaken. These contrasting perceptions show the real battlefield is not only physical logistics, but narrative dominance. Each region frames the ban in ways that align with its internal political needs. And in that divergence lies the deeper fragmentation of mobility governance. The risks and consequences are cascading. Immediate shortages of critical truck parts immobilize fleets. Even minor components, when unavailable, can halt heavy-duty vehicles for weeks. This translates into delays in food delivery, construction projects, and industrial supply. The economy slows not because factories stop producing, but because trucks cannot move the output. Strategic recalls emerge as a subtle weapon. By targeting compliance failures in truck fleets, regulators in rival states force operators to withdraw vehicles from circulation. Whether safety-driven or politically motivated, recalls disrupt the rhythm of mobility, adding layers of uncertainty to already strained systems. Infrastructure weaknesses are exposed. Bridges, highways, and fueling depots were designed for predictable flows. When parts shortages push fleets into alternative routes, these structures face overload. Failures increase, from mechanical breakdowns on roadsides to collapses of critical nodes in logistics networks. The fragility is systemic, not isolated. Insurance and finance sectors respond with caution. Credit for truck operators becomes harder to secure. Insurers raise premiums or withdraw coverage altogether. The perception of trucking as a stable asset class erodes. The sector shifts from backbone to risk factor within broader economies. The consequence is a hidden slowdown. GDP metrics may not yet reflect it, but the lifeblood of trade, truck-based freight, is becoming less reliable. And in intelligence terms, that fragility signals systemic vulnerability, one that adversaries can exploit further. Looking ahead, scenarios diverge. In the short term, truck fleets face operational paralysis in regions most dependent on U.S.-China trade flows. Black markets for parts expand, while operators cannibalize fleets to keep some units active. The disruption is tactical, but the ripple effects are strategic. Medium-term projections suggest accelerated investment in electrification. Nations see electric trucks as escape routes from parts dependence, yet new dependencies emerge, particularly on battery minerals sourced from Africa and processed in China. The cycle of dependency shifts but does not disappear. Autonomous trucking enters the conversation as a potential bypass. AI-driven convoys promise efficiency but demand components and data security that are already contested. Adoption is uneven, with Asia pulling ahead while the USA struggles to secure supply chains. Europe remains hesitant, trapped between regulation and necessity. Geopolitical alliances shift accordingly. Trade blocs realign based on who can guarantee mobility resilience. Nations with domestic truck industries and mineral reserves gain leverage. Those without must either accept dependency or risk isolation. Mobility becomes a measure of national power. The long-term outcome is clear. Mobility, once treated as infrastructure, is now treated as strategy. The ban on U.S. truck parts is not an isolated move. It is the opening signal in a wider contest to decide who controls the movement of goods in the 21st century. The ban on U.S. truck parts is not just about trade. It is a weaponized policy that reshapes supply chains, undermines fleets, and tests the resilience of entire economies. What looks like a technical disruption is in fact a global stress test, and the results will determine who moves forward and who stalls. Stay informed, stay ahead. Subscribe now and join the conversation below.